I'm Laura London, and this is the return of Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 134 is Jungian psychoanalyst Brian Mayo in Toronto, Canada. He studied English literature at the University of Western Ontario and went on to earn a master's degree in social work from the University of Toronto. While working as a mental health counselor, his analyst, Fraser Boa, connected Brian with Fraser's sister, the legendary and much beloved Jungian analyst Marion Woodman, to supervise his cases. He gained extensive experience working in outpatient psychiatry at Canada's largest mental health hospital, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, and in 1991 decided to train as a Jungian analyst. The following year, he was accepted by the Jung Institute in Zürich, where he spent the first 3 years of his training, and the final 2 years were spent in Toronto, where he was once again supervised by Marion Woodman. Brian graduated from the Jung Institute in 1997 with a thesis on the relationship between tattoos and the psyche. In 1999, he and a small group of analysts in Toronto, including Daryl Sharp, Robert and Dorothy Gardner, Douglas Kahn, and others, decided to establish an internationally accredited training program. Operational since 2000, the Ontario Association of Jungian Analysts is still the only program of its kind in Canada. Brian remains active with the program through teaching, administering exams, and providing analysis and supervision. He has lectured and given seminars in Montreal, Calgary, and Toronto on tattoos, graffiti writing, and comics as manifestations of the unconscious, which are his ongoing interests. Last month, his book, co-authored with fellow Jungian analyst Patricia Brannigan, was published by Inner City Books. Skin Deep: Manifestations of the Unconscious in Everyday Life explores how the phenomenon of the practice of tattooing demonstrates Jung's understanding of how the reality of the unconscious psyche manifests in our daily lives. Brian joins us today to discuss this topic and more. Please consider helping Speaking of Jung stay on the air by contributing to our tip jar on Patreon for just $5 a month, or by making a one-time or recurring donation through PayPal. You can find the links in the description box below or by visiting the support page on our website, speakingofjung.com. You can also help our YouTube channel grow by clicking the thumbs up on our video or thumbs down. That's up for you to decide. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It's free. I am also here to remind you of the importance of recording your dreams. Temenos Dream is a revolutionary dream tracking app available for iOS and Android. Now you can record your dreams by speaking into your phone or typing them into the app. Search for myths, legends, and fairy tales related to the themes in your dreams. Use the new advanced AI interpretation with a focus on Jung's work, looking closely at symbols and associations to consider shadow, anima, animus, archetypes, and much more. You can help support Speaking of Jung simply by downloading the app and creating a free account. Unlimited use is available with a premium subscription. Click on the link in the description box below or on our website, speakingofjung.com, where you will find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This video interview is being recorded on Wednesday, January 15th, 2025, through the magic of StreamYard. Hi, Brian. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Laura. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I would like to start by asking you about the enigma that is Fraser Boa. You shared with me that he was your analyst, and I don't know if our listeners know the name. I would suspect a lot of them do because of his film on Marie-Louise von Franz called The Way of the Dream, which is out there. Bootlegs are out there everywhere. But you knew him, you worked with him, he had a huge impact on your life, and I was wondering if you would share with us a little bit about that.
Sure. I didn't know Fraser personally, but, when my life was falling apart, and I'd seen a psychiatrist once or twice and felt they couldn't help me at all. I'd actually read the collected works in my early 20s, and I felt Jung knew what he was talking about. And so I was sort of living in the rural areas of Ontario at that time, and I just checked if there was a Jungian in Toronto, and lo and behold, Fraser, I think he just started his practice recently. And so we hooked up on the phone. He did sort of an over-the-phone assessment, gave me an interview a few days later, and I was lucky to go through his door. I mean, Fraser is just, he just got back. He trained with Von Franz, and that whole energy of that time he was there was in the room as well. But
in Zürich, you mean?
He trained in Zürich, and he just had a gift for working with dreams. I think anyone who worked with Fraser realized how good he was at connecting the unconscious and working and finding a unique way of responding to the story that came through his door with each person. And for me, it sort of changed my life. And, even though I was in such a mess when I initially saw him, I was really impressed by him. And so I asked him, could you share your story of how you became an analyst? And he did. He very courageously told me his story, where he was sort of falling apart, and someone recommended him see Bennett over in England, and that changed his life. And so I sort of that idea of perhaps becoming an analyst, even though I had no education or anything, set in there. And so I sort of made a dedication to correct myself first, and then eventually train as an analyst.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Bennett. That would be Edward Bennett.
Yes.
Was his analyst?
That was Fraser's analyst in England. Then when he got into the program, if my memory serves me correct, I think Fraser wasn't accepted the first time, and then he got in on the second time, and then eventually connected with Von Franz. Fraser was going to connect me with Von Franz if I had the good fortune of getting connected into Zurich, but her health issues sort of prevented that from ever happening. And then unfortunately, Fraser passed away at an early age.
Yeah, he did. And I think that's why not a lot is known about him. So that's why I wanted to ask you. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And then, as I mentioned in the introduction, Fraser's sister is Marion Woodman, Marion Woodman. She passed away a few years ago, and she supervised your cases before you trained to become an analyst. And then while you were in training, would you share with us a little bit about your experience with her?
Oh yeah, she was just, when you're with Fraser, Marion, you knew you were with the real deal. And I took a job up in rural Ontario, and it was a great experience. But a number of people wanted to work with their dreams, and I, just to be responsible, I realized I needed to be supervised. So I asked the lady who was directing the clinic if those cases I could get permission to be supervised by Marion, which she gave. And so Marion supervised those cases. It just, the breadth of her experience and just came out every time I met her. And so I felt very fortunate. And then when I was in Zurich, and I had to do the first year of my clinical, once I got through the propedoicum, the first year there, and I had to get all my colloquium I had to get all those hours before I'd be allowed to return. And then I sort of reached out to her, said, would you be prepared to supervise my cases? And she was, and it just added so much experience and dimension to my understanding of the psyche working with her.
So I've mentioned her many times on this podcast. Her book, Addiction to Perfection, was the first Jungian book I read. It was also published by Inner City Books. And I had to put it down because the first time I read it, I think I was in my late 20s or my early 30s, and I didn't understand it, but it still had such a profound effect on me. And then I picked it up later and kind of memorized parts of it. I had read it so many times. So that's wonderful that you knew her and she had such a great effect on you. And I mentioned also in the introduction, your thesis was on tattoos and the psyche. In your thesis, you covered the history of the tattoo and psychology, and you go into case studies. And that's pretty much what you do in the book, but of course you expand on it, right? So let's get into the book, which you co-authored with a fellow Jungian analyst, Patricia Brannigan. So I'm going to step back and let you share with us how this book came to be.
Yeah, it's a long story. And just to mention Patty here, Patty's here in spirit. She just asked me to represent the both of us here. So,
okay.
So giving a shout out to Patty. So, so the book itself took about 7 years. Back in 2017, my own unconscious was sort of hounding me that there's parts of my own development I was not following up on. And one of those, I'd always had a bit of a fear to publish or to write or stuff. And the constant badgering of the unconscious sort of got me off the couch. And so I decided to speak to my colleagues at one of our Ontario Association of Jungian Analysts regular meetings. And I said, I'm going to start a research study group. Anybody who's interested? And there's initially the first gathering, there was about 12 or something. It was a good turnout, but it whittled down to the 4. We had 4 regular ones, so every 4 or 5 months we would talk about research and stuff, and it was really a great little group. And part of that group, one of the 4, was Patty.
Okay.
So early on, I approached her. If we're going to have a research study group, well, maybe we should try and do some research. And so I asked her, would you be interested in doing something on tattoos? And so I think she hesitated a little bit at first, just the way I hesitated to jump into the study group. But then she came on board. And so Patty and I have done this journey together. And so there, initially our idea was to include the word association experiment as part of it. We need some funding for that because, people have to spend quite a few hours with you to go through it,
right,
the whole thing. And so we decided to approach the research committee at the International. And so we went through that and tried to put a research proposal together. And the long and short of the deal was after a year and a half, they said no. So we didn't get the funding we needed because they have so many people applying for it and they have limited funding.
Yeah.
But it was a great experience. We learned a lot. So then I said to Patty, why don't we do a book? And and so we decided to get rid of the word association experiment, and we're going to do it with 10 people, get a research participation agreement together. So fortunately, my stepson Perry is a lawyer, so we got that legal side taken care of, and he also helped us get the 10 people. So within a few days, we had the 10 people, and then we rented a place, did interviews, which were really, really enjoyable. All 10 of them. It was just a very enjoyable experience.
And those are, I'm just going to jump in here. Those are the case studies that are in the book.
Yeah. So 4 of them made it into the book, and nobody was more important than the other. But as you know, in life, some people are a bit more expansive and spontaneous in sharing their story. And when you're trying to analyze something and understand it and make a connection to your hypothesis, you need that data. So the 4 that were chosen were just because we had more data to try to work out, our argument about what tattoos were. And so we did that. We got the data and we started the process of analyzing it and that. And we sort of got ambitious at one point and said, well, why don't we include something on the comics and graffiti? And so then we did a thing we had the whole comic thing. There's a beautiful comic out by a fellow Chicagoan, Joe Thompson's The Scary Godmother. So we analyzed that, but we needed the images. And so we tried to approach her and connect with her, but we got no response. So, eventually we waited and realized, if I'd be reluctant myself probably if someone wanted to analyze my own comic, but it's a beautiful comic if anyone ever wants to read it. So
would you tell us again the name?
Scary Godmother by Jill Thompson. It's a beautiful tale about young Hannah who goes out Halloween for the first night. So the whole Halloween is great from the unconscious point of view. And she finds courage and the love of Scary Godmother. She's actually a positive feminine, even though that name, Scary Godmother, is a very positive feminine.
So I neglected to ask you, when I mentioned your thesis, we need to circle back because what I don't know is how you came to have an interest in this topic in the first place. So I know that in order to graduate from the Jung Institute, you have to write a thesis, and you chose this topic. And so that was back in 97, I think I said that you graduated from the Jung Institute.
Right.
And it's 2024 when your book on tattoos was published. So where did that initial interest in the psychology of the tattoo?
From those compulsory requests by the Institute that you have to do a thesis. And so every student at some point in that process of going through the training program, they wrestle, okay, what am I going to do my thesis on? And so for me, so my imagination just started scouring. First thing I did was I went to the library. They've got this little library at the training program at Kuznot there. And I looked at the book of people who'd done thesis from the opening day and see what had been done. And so, after a little while, for me, it was between either doing it on graffiti writing or tattoos. And I ultimately went with the tattoos. I just felt both were good topics for how the unconscious really is manifest.
So did you have personal experience with tattoos, graffiti writing, or just was an interest of yours?
Just an interest. No, I don't have a tattoo myself. I was fascinated by it.
Yeah.
Seeing the images on people's body and okay, what was the correlation for me? And so I started to walk into a few tattoo shops, and when you go in there and the images are on the wall and books they have, it just a whole atmosphere. It just felt like it's a place that the unconscious was participating.
And in the introduction to the book, what I found to be the most fascinating part of this whole thing is you bringing up the collective unconscious. And I have a friend who is now an analyst. And when I first started doing this podcast, he and I were talking a lot about this whole process and Jung and reading Jung. And he said, unless you've had an experience of the collective unconscious, you don't understand Jung. So when I was reading the introduction to the book, the first thing you point out is that subject. And I thought that was so important. I'm going to let you tell us, if you would, what you wrote about that.
Well, the reason, what your friend said, that makes a lot of sense. For me, Jung is really, I don't think he really gets enough credit for being the scientist he is. He's just a courageous explorer of trying to understand the psyche. And because of his experiences with the collective unconscious, the other side, the spirit, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And his scientific approach, his empirical approach, his dedication, his courage, I don't think he gets the recognition he truly deserves of being a scientist. For me, his works on alchemy are just pure science. So my experience of working in the field, both as an analyst and in the Jungian community, is that a lot of people struggle for really getting the real nature and reality of the collective unconscious, the side that comes through via dreams or it manifests in other ways, whether it's in pathological symptoms at your psychiatric hospital, whatever. It manifests in many, many ways. It's living with us every moment of the day. Slips through in Freudian slips, the unconscious will just make its way, its appearance in many shapes and forms. And for me, the tattoos was a way of showing how Jung's model of understanding the collective unconscious is there and real. And it's just another example of how Jung is so on the money, so on point of understanding the depths of the collective unconscious.
In the book, basically, you're looking at the reasons why people tattoo, the impulse to tattoo, and how the images of tattoos are manifestations from both the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious.
Yeah.
So let's get into that. Let's get into, because I don't have a tattoo either, but I see more and more tattoos. They're becoming more and more acceptable. There seem to have been a stigma attached to them, which just, I can only speak about here in the United States.
For sure.
I should have prefaced it with that.
Yeah.
So I'd like for you to tell us, since you delved into the history, how did all of this start with us putting images on our body? And you also, in the history, I just want to say this too, tattoos were typically used on prisoners and on slaves. So they were numbers, right? They were kind of like brands, but branding cattle. But now it seems like it's more artwork. And I have so many questions for you about it. So I'm going to let you tell us about the history behind this first.
Yeah, the history behind it, both from a psychological angle and just from a historical angle. There's some instances, the branding and the slaves, that wasn't, it was prevalent in certain areas of the world, but not all. Like some prisons would, they would identify their inmates by putting a number on them, or in some areas of the world, if you were in prison, you were released, they would put a tattoo signaling that you'd been a criminal, right? So that was one component, but there's dozens and dozens of ways, like in rituals and others. And
I just want to jump in. In those instances, the tattoo is done to you. It's not your choice. So we're looking at, or you are looking at, and we're here today talking about when it is one's choice.
Yeah.
To put a permanent image into our skin, and we need to talk about the skin and all of that. So,
well, so just from a psychological angle, people, our little offering to the Jungian community, Patty's and I's, is this book. So we did the 4 cases here. But on a broader level, it has huge implications historically for the development of consciousness, because from the beginning of time, there's been these impulses in people throughout the world to put something on their skin. So that has something to do with the ego and its response to an impulse. So from the very beginning of people walking this earth of ours, there's been that impulse from various people, various cultures, to put a tattoo on themselves when it's voluntary and not like when someone's branded.
Yeah.
And so, but to bring it into, so the impulse, when we did the 4 people and the 10 in total of participants in the study, everyone said they had an impulse to tattoo. And so following Jung's model, the impulse is experienced by the ego, but it doesn't originate there. It originates from the collective unconscious. So, and Jung defines the impulse as coming from the archetypal instinctual level. And so following the knowledge he's passed on to us and the data we collected regarding these people, we were able to test that hypothesis about the impulse, where it comes from, and we feel it's borne out. And so people have their own personal story of why they want a tattoo. So that they get the image. And so when Jung's talking about the archetype, he's talking about it has 2 aspects: the ultraviolet aspect, which is the image and the latent meaning within it, and the infrared aspect, which is the mode of action. whereas the ultraviolet is the mode of apprehension. So the tattoo itself that ends up in the skin comes from the infrared aspect of the archetype, which is the impulse to do something, to put a tattoo on it. So that's the action. And for us, getting the personal story of the courageous people who decided to be part of our study, we saw and heard their story and felt that Jung's understanding of the psyche was able to show that there's a dimension of their tattoo that was unconscious to them. And so we tried to tease that out and write about what we feel that the part of their tattoos they're not aware of, and that has to do with the archetypal dimension of the tattoo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the book, it seemed like in all of the case studies, the subject said that they didn't feel any different after having gotten the tattoo, and they didn't know why they chose that image. And so that's what you and Patricia look at, is what's underneath this. And I'd like for you to share with us why, I guess my question is, why what is the difference between choosing, let's say, a piece of artwork to hang in your home, and I have a story about that, versus that let's just say you purchase a painting of a lion, and you hang it in your home and you see it every day and you enjoy it, versus taking an image of a lion and tattooing it on your body where you can't see it. You can't look at it. Usually, I mean, if you have it on your forearm or on your hand, or maybe even on your biceps, you can see it. But otherwise, you can't see it. Other people can see it, but you can't. And that fascinates me.
Well, it's a great question. And my thinking function is my less developed part of me, but I'll try to answer it. The difference being is when you tattoo something on your skin, you're identifying with that image. There's an unconscious identification with that image. When you're grabbing, like say the example you get of a lion, you put the lion, it obviously will have some something to do with your psychology, whatever we put anywhere, because we like it, we're interested in it. But if we put it on a wall, there's already a differentiation. It's not on our skin, it's on the wall. So you can enjoy it, and whatever relationship it does have to any of our psychology, there's a difference between putting it on the wall and looking at it than putting it on your skin, and that and it's there permanently. There may be unconscious dimensions to why you've put a lion on the wall, but just to talk a bit about the skin and its relationship to the tattoo. So the skin and the ego, interestingly enough, have similar functions. The skin is a self-renewing organ of the body. Like 90% of the gray dust in your vacuum cleaner is discarded skin. So at the end of a week, there's about 1 billion skin cells all over your floor that you scoop up in your vacuum cleaner, and it weighs about the size of a lighter. And so the skin has that self-renewing capacity. The ego has the same self-renewing capacity, but on a psychological level.
Yeah.
Its function, its responsibility, the ego's responsibility, is to relate to the outer world and the inner world. And sometimes we can get complex for a few weeks, and that self-renewing quality is compromised, or we can get depressed or something, and that self-renewing quality is not there. It's one of the reasons that we go into analysis, is to improve the renewing capacity of our ego. And so both of those have that capacity, the skin and the ego, and they come together in this meaningful sort of way. And so our hypothesis is when they have personal reasons why they want to have a tattoo on their body. So when the tattoo machine is putting the image with their story, why it's on the skin, at the same time, that constellates the archetypal dimension, and rising from the depths of the psyche is an archetypal image. And our understanding and hypothesis is that the people, at least that we've interviewed to this point and know their story, are unaware of the archetypal dimension of that the ego is unconsciously projecting an archetype onto the skin. So that's where also, your excellent example about putting a picture on the wall, you're not necessarily unconsciously projecting an archetype onto the picture. It's not that can't happen. We can project something onto a chair. I mean, the unconscious is always, it can leak out anywhere, but the excellent example you gave, it's not this, it wouldn't be there as prominently. And there's also a differentiation because it's on the wall and not, but following up on your excellent question is graffiti, it's a book may do down the road, but graffiti, those tags, throw ups and wild style pieces in the back alleys of all the cities in North America. My experience is they project the unconscious archetypes onto their pieces. So your question is excellent. I'll be able to think more about it when we disconnect today.
Okay. So how is graffiti? I know you don't cover graffiti in the book, but it is
part of the initial manuscript, actually.
In the initial manuscript, but it was
through Scott. Yeah.
Couldn't include it because of not being able to legally use the images.
No, it was that was part of the 7-year-long journey. Part of the journey was to include graffiti writing, which we did, and we wrote it up. And
was just too long.
No, it's just, it wasn't. And I understood Scott, we're really happy that Scott embraced our little book and has been very supportive of it. And we're happy to be part of Daryl's distinguished publishing house.
And this is Inner City Books for the listeners that are not familiar, talking about Scott Milligan, who took the reins for Inner City Books after Daryl passed away.
Yeah, and so Scott, the feedback we got, let's see, the first manuscript that went to Inner City had, there was a section on graffiti writing. When they eventually got back to us, and which is encouraging, they said, we really like it. We love what you're doing. We feel the tattoo is more, we feel it's at a higher level. I understand why he said that. I actually didn't discuss it with Scott because we just wanted to get the book published. So he said, well, if you can get rid of the graffiti writing and replace it with another chapter on the tattoos, we'll consider. He didn't say they would publish it. He said, we'll consider it. So we went back to the drawing table, pulled out another case, spent another 4 or 5 months writing it up, submitted it. And thankfully, he said, yes, we want to publish it. So we got it across the finish line. And I think one of the reasons, what makes, at least from our perspective, the Skin Deep book have a cogency and relevance is because of the stories of the people and our attempts to connect that to the unconscious psyche. And we only had the photos of the graffiti stuff, and we didn't actually have graffiti writers. So we didn't have their personal story. It's just like, when the personal story is there, like when Jung does his 1928-29 dream seminar on that gentleman, it's his story that that makes everything come alive, right? So if in the future we put graffiti writing back on the table, we would include the stories of graffiti writing. Okay,
so let's get into one of the case studies then that's in the book on their tattoos. And these people get multiple tattoos. And like you mentioned in the book, it's almost like an addiction, or maybe it is an addiction. And I'd like to know why it's an addiction. And you know what it reminded me of? So I'm not one to speak. I'm going to speak anyway, because I don't have a tattoo and I don't have any children. But it reminds me of what I hear or what I see women do who they have a baby. They go through all this pain and discomfort And I from what I understand, it's an ungodly amount of pain. And then after the baby's born, they want another one. And then they want another one. And that's when I was reading about the tattoos, that they're painful to get, and you get it and you love it, and then you want another one.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can share with us one of your case studies where they just are getting tattoo after tattoo.
Yeah, okay, we'll take, what's the first lady? Mary, I think we call it. So Mary, see, some people talk about this addictive in nature, and that again is that the unconscious at play, and ego's feeling that compulsion from the unconscious, and other people just feel the impulse. So our experience was the ones that getting the story, it was very much like Jung often talks about, the risk of just interpreting a single image. So when we had several images, just as when you're working with someone in analysis, you start to see the sequence and start to feel more and get into their personal psychology, because they have multiple tattoos and the story with each tattoo, and they share their psychological personal history. Then we were able to get at the personal complexes, the feeling tone complexes, and the archetypal foundation that underlies those, and then follow the sequence of their psychological story, which we feel is compelling. And so for me, following Jung's model, which is extremely helpful, just as in dreams is a way of the unconscious manifesting and responding to our life, it's our understanding and experience that the unconscious manifests with the tattoos, and each tattoo is just like the unconscious responding to that life that's lived, and has a meaningful story to tell beyond the conscious story that the person shares. So it just allows us to show that the unconscious is alive and breathing and responding to each and every tattoo.
So it's an unconscious identification with an image.
Exactly.
And what happens when, before we get into the case study, what happens when somebody doesn't want the tattoo anymore? Because I know for me, I bought an oil, I spent way too much money on an oil painting once. This was, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. And it's been in storage for probably the past 14 years. It was a dream image of mine that I had seen when I was walking through an art gallery. I used to go to Santa Fe all the time. And you can't go to Santa Fe and not buy art. So I also wanted to support this artist. I purchased this painting because it looked like this image from this dream that I just couldn't shake the image. And then it just didn't speak to me anymore. And so it's in storage, and I'll probably be putting it up on eBay. Anyway, so what happens when somebody identifies with an image so much so that they get it tattooed on their body, and that's probably one of the reasons why I never got a tattoo. I'm not the only reason, that this doesn't speak to me anymore. It's there forever.
Yeah, that's great comment, observation. And 40% of tattoo work is cover up, right? So that goes.
Is that right? Okay.
So they put something, I love Betty, then a year later they don't love Betty, and then so they have to cover it up. And so what you say, like Von Franz will say, if you get a photograph and you put it on the desk, and after a certain period of time, that photograph loses its, just what you're talking about, that painting. And so that happens in the tattoo world all the time, that charisma, that identification, that verve of the tattoo diminishes. And that's also one reason they get another one, because the initial boost of the tattoo moves on to something else. But there's no one size fit all, because a projection can be there. People fall in love and there's a projection, and sometimes that projection onto the partner remains for life. Sometimes it recedes within months. And just like that can happen with anything.
Mm.
A projection is, an unanalyzed datum of experience. It just happens. And whether or not anyone ever realizes what's been projected, that's an open question. So, but that's a huge part of the tattoo world cover up because just what you're saying, that energy's not there. But and one of the things, though, just to tag on to your comment, is that, like when Franz will talk about therapy, when we go into analysis and what often happens when people are working on their dreams or whatever their issues are, then they start to recover and they feel that energy because they're tapping into the unconscious, and that vivifying, energizing of the unconscious starts to be experienced by the ego. And in my experience is like the people that in this study, most of them, even the ones that didn't feel there was a psychological component, said they felt a happiness. Like I didn't quite answer your question. Like Mary, every time she got a tattoo, felt happy. And for our understanding is that energy of happiness is because she's tapping into the archetypal aspect of the unconscious. That energy comes with the impulse, with actually getting the tattoo. And so sometimes that stays for a while. Some people feel that connection, like the one fella, Joseph, who got the 5 circles around his arm. It was a big ethical statement because, as you said earlier, a lot of people, they want to get a tattoo, but for a long time in Western society, at least, there was this stigma that you're from the other side of the tracks, you had questionable morality, that whole story. Yeah. And so part of his story was he wanted to get a tattoo to claim himself and say, I'm a good person, and getting a tattoo is just fine. And but that five mandalas that he had around his arm, because he was a very anxious sort of person, he had mandalas in most of his tattoos. And from our perspective, that was his ego unconsciously being confused, anxious, and disoriented sometimes. That centering temenos aspect of the mandala helped his ego to ground himself in life.
So let's go back to the case study. If you could maybe condense it for us to give the listeners an example of what is in the book and how you structured each case study. Mm-hmm. There's pseudonyms. You describe the individual. These are not people who are in analysis, right?
Right.
And you find out what tattoo they got, and then you gathered information on what that symbol meant to them, mm-hmm. and that all of them really were unaware of what about the symbol spoke to them. And so where I'm still very curious is, why take that archetypal image and kind of burn it into the skin? As opposed to, I don't know, getting, let's say, a necklace. This is Saturn with a star. Mm-hmm. Okay, I got this to symbolize my second Saturn return, which is just had the last pass finished. And I could have gotten a Saturn tattoo, right? Mm-hmm. But I didn't. So did you look at why somebody didn't get a pendant, instead had it inked onto their skin?
No, we haven't followed all those ramifications.
But the link is that the skin and the ego.
For whatever reason, mm-hmm. there's a certain percentage of the population. In the past, in the early 1900s, about 10% of the population. Now it's about 30% of the Western in America and Canada, and 50% of that is between 18 and 35.
Yeah.
So 50% of young people have a tattoo. Mm-hmm. And so it's just that whatever they unconsciously just want to put something on their skin. And the aesthetics of it, like the Joseph in the book, he really liked the aesthetics, and all of them like the aesthetics. So the aesthetic component, that they like it on their skin, the beautification, that's a large part of many of why people get it. And so they make that decision. And so we just follow up with their impulse. So, okay, certain people want that. So we just try to understand, is there a correlation between the psyche and what's on the skin? We feel there's a compelling argument that there is.
Listeners of the podcast will know that we've done a lot of episodes on the Korean K-pop group BTS, and before they went on hiatus to fulfill their mandatory military enlistment obligation, they each got a tattoo of the number 7 somewhere on their body to symbolize there's 7 of us in this group. BTS consists of 7 members, and they're very close knit. And they had to go their separate ways for, I think it's 18 months, their military enlistment. So what I found curious about that is some of them got the tattoos in visible areas, and others got them in not so visible areas where they had to actually hold back the clothing to show us where the tattoo was. So I was very curious about getting the people who got tattoos that not only can they not see, but we can't see. For instance, there's another member of BTS who has the phases of the moon tattooed down his spine. So he can't even see them. And you were talking about aesthetics. He can't see them. What are you going to do? Get a hand mirror, walk up to a mirror and go like this and look at your back? I mean, is it a sex thing? I don't know. What did you discover about getting a tattoo in an area that the person can't even see?
Well, yeah, and each, that's why it's a great comment and a great question. And so that's why the case study is so important. There's the 4, but each person that gets that tattoo, their story and the reasons for it and what archetypes, what feeling tone complex are activated, it's all individual. And the placement on the body is so important. Like there's the one, Sophie, she has one behind the ears. She can't see it.
Yeah.
The first one, Mark, we give the example of how we're going to approach from a Jungian perspective to unpack if there's any psychological meaning with the tattoo. He has it on his back, and it's his comments. So we have to follow his story, and a few of them that put them on places where you can't see. Their comment was, "I don't know whether I'm really into this tattoo thing right now." So I'm not quite sure why I put it there, but I think part of my story is that I don't know if I'm quite committed to it. So I'm going to put it at some place where people can't see. And not only they can't see, but they themselves can't see.
Nobody can see it. So what does that say about the unconscious connection then? How is that a manifestation of the unconscious?
Well, let's take the first one. So the first one, Mark. So Mark gets a tattoo on his back. Right. So his grandfather, he was 22 at the time, and he was about 35 when we interviewed him, and he had 6 tattoos. And we just used his first tattoo as an example how we're going to approach to try to unpack, to figure out whether or not there's a psychological component that they're unconscious of. So the fact that it's on the back, he puts the shield, the family crest with the crossing swords. So the whole dynamic, it really, the more it's hidden, the more there's a good chance they're unaware of the psychological component, but they want unconsciously, are tapping into something that they want. So take Mark. Mark is just a fascinating story. He put the family crest, his granddad died, so he wanted to memorialize the memory of his granddad. So he's very touched and moved and wanted that on him. He puts it at the back, but then he also had ever since he was a young boy, he was interested in knights and the whole story of King Arthur, all that kind of stuff. And so he put the swords and the shield behind the crest because he wanted that in there as well. And when you get his story, and then you try to unpack the psychology of it, at 22, he realized he was way shyer, way more nervous. He said, this isn't really me. Why am I so shy? Why am I so nervous out in public? And so he made the decision at the age of 22, when he got the tattoo, is I want to change. I want to be the person I feel I'm meant to be. So he started doing public speaking. He started doing all kinds of more extroverted things. He started to consider being in a profession where you have to have a persona of confidence and composure and take charge of things. So he had that conscious. He wanted to do that. So that's all part of his tattoo. But still at age 22, he was still nervous, still shy. And it takes time to get that persona of confidence and composure. And so the tattoo coming at the back, there's two mandalas on his back. A mandala, according to Jung, is always an attempt at self-cure, self-renewal, on the path of individuation.
Yeah.
But it shows up when a person is either confused, disoriented, has lost their way. And so it's interesting. So his ego unconsciously, in getting that tattoo, selects images, mandala images, to secure and ground his ego. And one of the things being at the back, he's not aware that's what he's doing, right? And so his tattoos, and that initial tattoo, is very much, and he unlike some of the others we put in the story, he really thought for a couple months. He loves to think. He's got a great imagination. He put a lot of thought into what he wanted to put into his tattoo. So that whole story's there. And part of his story is with the swords and the psychological connotation of the sword with differentiation of consciousness, that whole thing. So the conscious unconscious split is he was consciously aware of the sword because he was he was interested in justice. Those things meant a lot to him, but he's not aware of the unconscious component of the symbol, which has to do with psychological differentiation. Sword often is like Excalibur, is a pointing to the path to individuation. And so there's a whole underlying of positive archetypal energy that he was tapping into to develop himself. See, he consciously wanted to develop, and he's unaware that he's unconsciously identifying with archetypal energy when he puts that tattoo on himself. And even though it's on its back, he's unconsciously identified with that image.
And does the act of tattooing and having the tattoo and experiencing the tattoo, does it sort of help somebody psychologically?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, there's so many million people who have tattoos, so I can't make any blanket general statements. But the four people, each of the four that are included, there's positive ramifications of whether a momentary or a more lasting boost of confidence, of self-esteem, and for sure, and all four, there's this, they're unconsciously tapping into a process of individuation. And
interesting.
And we suggest part of the ultraviolet component of the image, the latent meaning in the image, at some point in time, the individual, the conscious ego, would needs to ask those questions. What is the psychological meaning of some of these images?
And I'm still really curious about the taboo, that they were taboo and they're no longer taboo, that was a stigma attached and there's no longer a stigma in general, right? I'm sure that still in some families, parents say, no, you can't get a tattoo. But it seems like everybody that I come across who's in their 20s, again, here in the US, everybody has a tattoo. Everybody in their 20s has a tattoo. And it amazes me, because why all of a sudden did this become acceptable? What do you think's behind that?
Well, it's a great question, and I can't give you a great answer, a full-fledged answer, because it's so involved. But I can partially answer it. And
Yeah.
through the ages, like say for instance, Christianity's had a huge influence on whether or not people can or cannot have tattoos. Like there's in the Middle Ages, there were certain centuries where there was no tattoos, and that was largely because the people in the powers that be in Christianity, there's places in the Bible where it says thou shalt not put images on your skin, right? And so there's other parts of the Bible where it's a bit more favorable to that, but there would be papal announcements and whatever that one is not to put images on one's skin. And so for many senses, so Christianity had a huge impact on whether or not to have tattoos in Europe and North America. And at a certain point, so part of your question is that seems to have disappeared, right? Because now people are getting it. And so I think it goes into the question where that whole cultural thing where its influence is lessening and people are feeling more free to express themselves and be themselves. And they say, heck with it, I want a tattoo on me, and there's nothing wrong with it. And if I want a tattoo of a rose on my arm, I'm just going to do that. And in the past, that's just one example. Christianity had a huge impact on whether or not tattoos were allowed.
So we're coming to the end of our time today, Brian, and I'd like to ask if you would just kind of give us a summary of the book that we can share with the listeners and leave them with.
Sure, Laura. So just to paraphrase the summary of the book itself, basically, it was our hypothesis that the tattoo has something to do with Jung's understanding of the psyche, both the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. So we undertook this research. We got the stories of the individuals, and thanks so much for participating, those people. And we felt that their story, their conscious reasons for getting the tattoo, there was also an unconscious story that they weren't aware of. And so we've followed that up, and using Jung's model of the psyche, we showed how the ultraviolet aspect of the archetype, the image and the latent meaning in it, plus the infrared aspect, which is the tattoo itself, is a correlation between that and Jung's understanding of the psyche. And projection itself is the key to us understanding the role projection plays in the tattoo. Was the key for us was Jung's work on alchemy and his how the alchemist projected their psyche, their psychological process into the laboratory. And so that was the key for us to really understanding projection. And we feel that Jung's right on the money about projection and the part the unconscious plays in things like the tattoo.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. Really appreciate you coming on here today for your first podcast interview and sharing all of that with us. And there will be links to purchase the book in the show notes or in the description of this video. It's available on Amazon and also directly from Inner City Books. They ship worldwide. Thank you so much for joining us, Brian.
Thanks so much, Laura. It's great talking to you.
Speaking of Jung is not just a podcast, it's also a website. Please visit speakingofjung.com, where you will find extensive information on the life and work of C.G. Jung, show notes and downloads for all of our 156 episodes, a comprehensive books page, a blog, and much, much more. All of our episodes are also available on YouTube podcasts, which you can access by subscribing to this channel, Jungian Laura. It's free. Just click the subscribe button below. I created Speaking of Jung nearly 10 years ago. This year is our 10th anniversary, and all of our content is still free to access, but it is not free to produce. Please consider contributing to our tip jar on Patreon for just $5 a month, or our support page at speakingofjung.com/support for links on other ways to help keep this podcast and our website alive. And something I'd like to add is I have started a newsletter. It's an email newsletter. It will be sent out just once a month. That's all. If you've written to me in the past 2 years, I've already added you to the list. If you are a Patreon member, you've been added, and all of our guests have been added as well. There will be a link on the website for you to sign up. It's not active yet, but look out for that this week, probably later today or tomorrow. And then if you've written to me on social media, I do not have your email address. So if you would like to receive the once a month Speaking of Jung newsletter, please go to our website and sign up there. So with very special thanks to all of you who have corresponded with me during our hiatus, privately and on social media, thank you. To Scott Milligan and Liz Jefferson at Inner City Books, I am Laura London, and you've been watching a very special video edition of Speaking of Jung.